Sober October, Day 30. What does the Bible teach about alcohol use? Is there an amount that is okay? The previous podcast, we looked at what the Bible warns regarding the overuse or abuse of alcohol. And today, we see what it prescribes as wise, careful, and thoughtful use. I'll get right to the point. We all fall into two categories in terms of how we should think about drinking alcohol, either in moderation or not at all. For some people, moderation will keep them from experiencing the consequences and the foolishness that the Bible warns about. For others, abstinence is the only good, right, and wise way to deal with alcohol. And there's a few reasons for that. I want to remind us why we even consider the question of how I should drink. We care about this question and we wrestle with our drinking habits because our relationship with alcohol affects our relationship with Jesus. Too much can and will impact our judgment, our behavior, lead to shame, lead to regret. Not exactly a recipe for faithfulness or wise living. So we carefully consider what Scripture says, not to follow some religious code or earn something or achieve something or anything related to gaining some status with God or perfection in our behavior. None of that. We do it because one, it's wise, and two, it'll keep us on the path of following Jesus faithfully. And without exception, the biblical ideal around alcohol is avoid drunkenness. And there are really only two ways to achieve that, which seem to be expressed in the Bible as moderation and abstinence, which are expressed in the Bible as moderation and abstinence. We do see abstinence in Scripture, mostly in terms of certain people who are in specific roles or for various reasons. They are commanded to abstain from alcohol. We see it commanded in Leviticus 10 to Aaron and the priests while they're on duty. We see it number 6 to the Nazarites, which while they're taking a vow. We see it in Proverbs 31. It states that wine and beer are not for kings or rulers. Other instances are during a pregnancy while the Israelites are in the wilderness. Daniel, John the Baptist. There are times when alcohol is strictly forbidden by God. Outside of that, the term frequently used is temperance, which means self-restraint and moderation. Paul, writing to Timothy in 1 Timothy 3:8, he says of deacons, which is a leadership role in the early church, that they should, quote, be men worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine. This is a specific command for alcohol, but the idea of temperance is all over the New Testament. Romans 13:14, 1 Thessalonians 5:6, Titus 2:2 and 2:12, 2 Peter 1:5. Sometimes drunkenness is referenced and sometimes it's not, but the command for self-control and moderation is applicable to alcohol and other desires that we have. So there are really two choices for a follower of Jesus to consider. Do I seek moderation? And if so, how? Or do I seek abstinence? And if so, how? I think we've offered a lot of ideas and thoughts all month for people who need abstinence. For someone who struggles with alcohol use, you might think moderation gives you permission to continue to drink. I just need to be more disciplined, more in control. That's what the Bible tells me to be. Well, here's the deal. An addict lacks self-control. And so that limits the option down to abstinence. You might say, well, God can give it to me. He can give me control. Absolutely, he can. But I recommend going and watching a video that I made called Thorns, Weakness, and Grace, where I talk about the struggles God gives us and how they're used by him to draw us to him continually. Sometimes he leaves a thorn in our side, and he doesn't take it away. Anyway, moderation for some people just isn't realistic. You need sobriety, and you need abstinence. So the only other option seems to be moderation. So let's look at some verses in the New Testament that provide guidance. In 1 Corinthians 5:11, Paul writes, "But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler. Do not even eat with such a one." This is a verse about boundaries. We have to limit who we're around. Why? Because a crowd can overpower our self-control and it can suck us in. I know you know what I'm talking about. When we're around people, we just tend to act like people. So boundaries are about protection, and in order to stay on the path, we need to protect ourselves from influences that can hinder us. Peter says something similar in 1 Peter 4, 1-7. It's a little long. It says, "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, so as to live for the rest of time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God." Then he goes on to say this, "Don't be, quote, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they," which is the non-believers, "are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers." Man, there's a lot going on in there, some intense language. I do like drinking parties, but really, what he's saying is that don't do these things. People are going to be surprised when you exercise moderation or abstinence. Don't let their surprise you. Also, we heard a word in that verse, sober-minded. It's from the Greek word sophronio. Cool word. It can mean clear mind, sane mind, right mind, but it can also mean self-control, ability to curb one's passions, to be calm. It's the ability to think clearly, a thoughtful person, someone who sees danger in excess and the wisdom of moderation. Also, sober-minded is sometimes translated as self-control, or as Tim Keller has defined it, self-command. It's the ability to tell yourself what to do. So you'll see sober-minded paired with the idea of self-control quite a bit. 1 Peter 1:13, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be bought for you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." 1 Peter 5:8, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Luke 21:34, this is Jesus saying, "But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap." Romans 12:3, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourselves more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." So the idea is clear thinking, sober judgment. Alcohol does not help us have good judgment or to be sober-minded. A sober mind comes from a sober body, a sober brain. Also, this is the ideal presented especially for people in certain roles. But don't think because you're not in a role it doesn't apply to you. We all have influence and we all lead others in different ways. A couple examples. 1 Timothy 3 says, "Therefore, an overseer," which is a leader, "must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard," right? Titus 1:7 and 8. "For an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, lover of good, self-controlled, disciplined." So there is an ideal for everyone. That ideal helps people lead, and that ideal helps us follow Jesus. Finally, a reminder that this isn't just about rule following or anything like that. This is about relationships with others, and most importantly, a relationship with Jesus. That's a relationship that if you have that should take precedent over everything. So, some final thoughts. What's right for you? Abstinence or moderation? If you are unsure, you might need to go back and listen to some of the podcasts in Sober October, specifically days 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, which deal with the evidence that we can find in our lives that point to alcohol being a real problem. And if alcohol is a real problem, abstinence is your best route forward. But if it's moderation, how will you seek that? If it's abstinence, how will you go about that? And no matter who you are, you got to ask questions like, what boundaries do you need? Who can support you? Who can help you? Who can you talk to about this? And how will you trust God to help you? That's it for today. One last pod tomorrow. So as always, thanks for listening.